The Rocketeer rocket pack is shooting hot exhaust across your butt. If you got buns of steel or asbestos, no problem. So let's strap an explosive that's going to shoot hot gases out to our back. That's the idea here. Yeah, and it's made of metal, so metal tends to conduct heat itself, right?
Yeah.
So
3, 2, 1, punch it.
Could you jump to light speed in that tin can? Go back in time in a DeLorean. Will it crash or take to the sky? Tell me, smart guy, does it fly?
welcome to Does It Fly, the podcast that puts your favorite sci-fi properties, inventions, and conceits to the test. I'm your mad scientist, Hakeem Oluseyi.
And I'm your pop culture expert, Tamara Krinsky. Time to dive into today's topic and see, does it fly? Hakeem!
Tamara, yes. Are you welcoming me into your home, or am I welcoming you into my home?
I think it's kind of like a liminal space in between because we're in cyberspace.
That's right. And we're welcoming all of humanity into our cyber home.
That is right. Welcome to Does It Fly, the podcast where we look at the science and story of your favorite sci-fi gadgets from movies and fantasy films and TV shows and things like that.
Yes, we talk about shows that we love, but also shows that we're newly discovering. So
That's right.
This one falls into the former category for me. It's would you consider our show today to be a cult classic? Because it's not one that hit hard when it came out, but then it slowly caught on and people realized, hey, this is a pretty good movie.
Yeah, I think it does. I think it does fall into that category. We are talking about something that fuels the imagination, The Rocketeer.
Love it.
1991.
The Rocketeer. Yes. The Rocketeer, 1991, which is the year I graduated college.
Okay, so do you have any memory? Like, do you remember being aware of this movie? Because I know, like, when I was in college, I actually feel like it was almost like a black hole of stuff coming out in the movie theaters. Like, I just kind of didn't even think about it too much.
Right. Yeah. That year was not a good going to the movies year for me, just because of all the, everything happening. But I knew about it. I knew about The Rocketeer. And so when I finally got an opportunity to see it in the early 90s, I saw it and I loved it. I love is the, again, I'm using the word that I don't know if I'm using correctly. Is the word kitschy? It's set in the 30s. And, I love period pieces, right? The 30s isn't that far ago, but it has a style to it. And then,
this definitely falls into the period piece movie category. Again, just quick spoiler alert for those who may not have seen this movie. Again, it's a 1991 movie, so you've had some time to watch it. But just in case, now would be the opportunity to go watch the movie. You can easily find it on streaming services, and then come on back and listen to our podcast as we break down some of the stuff, but we don't want to reveal anything before it's time for you. So, all right, spoiler alert. So yes,
spoiler alert. And it's also a age alert, right? Because there's a lot of people born since 1991. We're like, if you didn't get to see it when it came out.
Yes, that is true. There may be people who are not familiar with it because they were not the right age to see it. But yeah, so it came out in 1991. It was directed by Joe Johnston. And it's a period piece. It's inspired by the comic book that was created by Dave Stevens. And it actually took a while in development for them to make it.
You know what? That is poetic. Because that's the same thing I would say about rocket technology.
Interesting.
Right? Yeah. It took a while because what we're talking about here is the technology that, if you look at the practitioners of who pioneered it, they would call it a rocket belt. And the reason why they so strongly emphasize that is because everybody was calling them a jetpack. Right? We're calling these devices jetpacks, but there is a big difference between jet engines and rocket engines, right?
Okay, wait, before we get into that, because this is what I want to hear about. Let's just quickly set the stage for folks who may not be familiar with the movie or
Yeah.
or maybe saw it back in 1991 and it's been a while since you were thinking about it. So the basic gist is that, as you said, it's set in the 1930s. It's 1938. So right before World War II kicks off, and you have the Rocketeer, whose name is Cliff, and he, is a would-be daredevil pilot. He's got his side, and he's played by Billy Campbell. He's got his sidekick Peavy, who's played by Alan Arkin, and they're trying to win, flying races. This is still at the time when aviation was developing, and they come across this jetpack in their barn, or jet belt. You'll set me straight on that later. But for now, rocket pack. So it's basically, to me, the layperson, it looks like basically a backpack that has little jet engines in it, and it's got throttles through the gloves. And there's a whole big adventure that ultimately involves the government, gangsters, Nazis, and movie stars, as everyone is trying to get their hands on this rocket pack, jet belt, etc., which is now where I'm going to kick it over to you to talk about whether the science of what they have in this movie flies.
All right, the science of the Rocketeer. Let's get to it. Let's get to the science of the rocket itself, because when I delved into the history of the development of the rocket, remember how I said that's poetic because of the long time of development? Well, the invention of the idea of the rocket goes back to ancient Greece. Expanding gases shot out of a nozzle and directed can generate mechanical motion, right? So the idea of taking something and turning it into mechanical motion is basically the idea behind every engine or motor, right? So remember, the first engines were steam engines. And as it goes, the very first illustration of this concept was by this ancient Greek guy named Hero of Alexandria. All right. Now, Hero is also famous because in the year 60 BCE, he's the guy who figured out the law of reflection for light, which is that the angle of reflection is equal to the angle of incidence, right? So Hero of Alexandria was doing things. But what he did is, if you have a cylinder or a globular shaped vessel, and you have two oppositely directed exit nozzles, and you put some water in there and add a source of energy, heat energy by a flame, once the water starts to boil and steam shoots out of these two, it'll rotate, right?
Okay.
Yeah. So it takes centuries, right? Almost, over 1,500 years before you get an actual steam engine that's moving railroad trains around the world, that sort of thing, right? But the idea of strapping a rocket on your back does not occur until 1961. And not only that, the idea of using a rocket to send humans or anything else into space was 1861. So you go back to a technology that's conceived of in ancient Greece, and it takes all these centuries and millennia for us to get to the movie The Rocketeer.
I had read, though, that in Nazi Germany they were actually looking at jetpack technology, though, or trying.
Oh, really? I didn't see that. I didn't see that, but I know that they didn't.
They may not have realized it, but they were trying to experiment with it. Yeah.
Well, that's interesting because the Nazis do play a critical role in the development of rocketry, right? In particular, their World War II V-2 rocket was the first human craft to go into space, the first human craft to break the sound barrier, and all those scientists ended up in the United States and the Soviet Union developing those rocket programs, right? Yeah. So there is a huge, Nazi innovation of war technology, right? Is an unfortunate history to get to what is now an incredibly useful technology, right? And we see rockets all over the place.
Yeah, I mean the Saturn rockets directly came from that. So
right, exactly, yeah. And so I flew Nike boosted Black Brant rockets as a graduate student, and so I think a lot of these are holdovers from World War II. So anyway, here's the idea of the development of the rocket. So rocket conceived, rocket invented by the Chinese. Right? Not for the purpose of strapping it to your back, not for the purpose of going into outer space, and not even yet used in warfare, right? It's like, hey, woo, nice. Right? So then at a certain point, the Chinese decide to let's use it in warfare. They kind of suck. So it's not until I think the late 18th century, late 1700s, that in southern India, they actually develop a not useful, but how do I say, effective
operational
military, a military rocket that will actually do some damage, right?
Okay.
And it turns out that a British military man hears about what's going on in southern India, develops the technology further. And so in the War of 1812 between the US and England, they start bombarding the US with rockets. Right?
Rockets, red glare.
Exactly.
There
Exactly. Right.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah, right. And so the thing is that other military technology is developing, and the rockets sort of get kicked to the curb because you're not as effective as guns become more and more effective. These rudimentary rockets are not as effective. All right. But listen, what I've talked about so far is the engineering, prototyping, building things development. A big part of engineering is also mathematics. All right. And so there's another huge coincidence here. And that is that at the same time that the Indians made an effective war weapon, and the term rocket from the French word, meaning the pointy end of a spindle thing, is coined, is the same time that Isaac Newton drops Newton's laws of motion. And so now you have a foundation for the mathematics of rocketry.
Right.
But guess what? The so-called rocket equation, the equation that sort of like, guides you in terms of given amount of fuel, how much speed can I get, basically. Okay. That still takes centuries. Takes another like 200-300 years to come about, right? Even though the foundation was there. So the slow speed, like, we could have been flying around on jetpacks. In the year one,
Right. If only the mathematicians had figured it out and gotten their shit together.
Right. If Euclid, and Pythagoras had kicked in, right? And invented calculus. Right. So, but, the thing about that equation and, first two things. Newton's 3 laws of motion. The third law is that for every action, there's an opposite and equal reaction. That is what governs rockets. And so that is why they actually work in space. They're not pushing on the air. They're not pushing on the ground. It's like, if I throw something this way, the laws of physics say I move backwards that way, right? So that our center of mass stays in the same location. All right. Okay. Essentially, right? So what am I getting at here? But it's the second law that is where you derive the rocket equation. And here's what's really interesting. Newton's second law of physics, we typically teach students, is force equals mass times acceleration. You've probably heard that, right?
Yeah.
That is not Newton's second law of motion. That is Newton's second law of motion in a special case scenario that does not apply to rockets. So what Isaac Newton said was that the amount of motion, the change in the amount of motion, is due to the net force. So what we call mass times acceleration is really the change in the amount of motion.
Can you give me like a practical example?
Yes. Suppose I throw a baseball that weighs 1 pound.
That's weird. I was going to ask you, I was like, maybe there's like a baseball analogy. That's weird.
That's our connection. It's our connection.
Okay. Sorry. Didn't mean to interrupt your example.
That's our quantum entanglement of our brains. So it's happening. Right? What was I saying? I completely
baseball
forgot.
Example of
baseball example. So what do I mean by the amount of motion?
Yeah.
If I throw something, it's not just the speed. It's the speed multiplied by the amount of stuff, mass. So if I throw one baseball at 10 miles per hour, I have half the motion of if I throw that one baseball at 20 miles per hour, or I throw 2 baseballs at 10 miles per hour. One right? So it's the combination of mass and speed. So what makes it mass times acceleration is that changing speed is what acceleration is, right? So if you assume that the mass does not change, a change in the amount of motion does mean mass times acceleration. But the thing about rockets is their mass does change because they burn fuel.
They burn the fuel.
Exactly. So that's completely different from throwing a baseball that is not burning fuel, right? Its mass remains a constant.
Okay.
Right. Yeah. So if you say, I want to go higher and faster, I'm going to add more fuel. But now you weigh more.
Now you have more mass.
Now you have more mass, right? So the rocket equation, what it relates to is the ratio of the beginning mass and ending mass to how much you change your speed. And what it tells you is that doubling your mass of fuel does not double your speed. It's not linear. It's exponential or logarithmic, right? So you have to have way more fuel to get a doubling of your speed, right? It's not just doubling the fuel. So anyway.
Wait, and just one other thing too, because in my own nerdy way, I've been like doing a little bit of a dive just at, like my basics on physics because just wanting to understand stuff better. So just to be really clear too, mass and weight, different, right? Like mass,
different things.
Tell me if I've got this right finally. Mass is basically, if you think of it, it's the amount of stuff.
Yes.
Weight is how you measure the amount of stuff with the effect of gravity. So like mass, if you take that out into space, it's still the same amount of stuff, but the weight is different because the effect of gravity. Now, when we're on Earth, when we talk about mass, we often, at least I growing up, heard like mass and weight talked about interchangeably because we're always talking about the constant of Earth gravity. So like my question is, when you're going into talking about rockets, which take you up ostensibly, and gravity changes, so you can't talk about them mass and weight interchangeably because the effect of gravity changes.
Absolutely.
Did I get that right?
So mass is the amount of stuff, but here's something interesting that Albert Einstein discovered. Mass is an illusion. The only thing that exists really is energy. So when you say E equals MC squared, that shows you the equivalence of mass and energy. He's saying it's not just a mathematical thing. What we conceive as mass is really confined energy, confined in a particular way. But anyway, right? That's why it can be converted. It's a whole other topic. Right?
Back to Rocketeer and the jetpack and the science of the jetpack.
Let's get back to the jetpack. Right. Yeah. So if there is a defining scene in the movie, I mean, there are a lot of defining scenes, right? That's the thing. But the one that jumps out to me as far as the rocket pack goes is saving the friend who's about to crash in the plane at the air show. And this is his first time taking the rocket and becoming a hero and doing heroic things. Now let's contrast that rocket pack with the real ones that eventually were created 30 years or so, or 20 some odd years after the events in the movie are supposed to have occurred, right? Number one, the design is very different. The Rocketeer rocket pack is shooting hot exhaust across your butt. If you got buns of steel or asbestos, no problem. So let's strap an explosive that's going to shoot hot gases out to our back. That's the idea here. Yeah, and it's made of metal, so metal tends to conduct heat itself, right?
Yeah.
So the ones that they actually built, the nozzles come out across the shoulders, right? There's a tube that goes horizontal and down like this. So it's away from the body. In the Rocketeer, one thing about these jetpack rockets, or these rocket belts, as they're called, is that because they're so fuel hungry, flight times are typically very short, okay? Like 30 seconds or so. The second thing is that they're notoriously hard to control in terms of maneuverability and just safety. All right. And so if you look at how steering is done on the real life jetpack, the little nozzles, just like with fighter jets and real rockets, the nozzle actuates. It moves around to direct the flow of gases in slightly different directions, which turns the rocket or the person driving the rocket. So if you look closely at those little nozzles, they move these really tiny, but the point is, I'm getting at is, they're very subtle and difficult to control. In the movie, the dude straps the rocket on his back and just goes and is an expert in free flight immediately. And he doesn't direct his flight.
Expert immediately, but
okay, listen. He's not flawless, but he's pretty much an expert. Some things are just so difficult that if you can do them at all, right, you can be deemed an expert at it because it just takes so long to get there to be able to do it at all, right?
Yeah.
So he starts off with a very difficult to control rocket pack too, right? And what is the solution? A rudder on a dang helmet, not nozzle control. So, jetpacks or rocket packs and rocketry in themselves are amazing, right? You can build them yourself, you can fly them yourself, be safe. If you ever gone to one of those rocket parties, which I did in Gasworks Park in Seattle one year, it was pretty awesome. I had my son when he was a little tot and he was running around helping to retrieve rockets. It's amazing stuff, right? And if you look at the military jetpacks that are in existence today, they're not like that, right? They're on the arms, you might have it on the back, right? So they have more control points, okay? And they're used for very specific purposes that are not what this guy was doing. that are a little less ambitious, right? Let's just say. As fascinating as they are, it don't fly. The rocket pack as presented in the movie is out of time, is technologically not the solution that would work. And the guy is just, he must have some super mutant rocketeering powers. So definitively, no, the technology in the Rocketeer does not fly. It's a little far-fetched. It's a little too ambitious for what would have been possible at the time. And what would have been possible even in the 60s or 70s, right? I mean, the way we were doing it then when it was pioneering and developing is not how it's done in that movie. And, that probably was everybody's first idea, right? I know what we'll do. We'll put a rocket on the back and put a rudder helmet on. We're good to go. Got these gloves.
Well, look, it makes sense that it was ambitious because the source material for this is a comic book. Right. True. When you think about that, when you think about, the origin story of it, like I said, this was in development for a while and it went through a couple different incarnations as Disney was figuring out what label it was going to be introduced under.
What do you mean by label? Like PG, PG-13, G, that type of thing?
No. I don't even mean the rating. I mean, Disney has a couple of different divisions. And at the time, like it could be released under Disney, it could be released under Touchstone, depending on who they wanted the audience to be. And initially, this was going to be for a slightly more mature audience. And so like in the comics, his girlfriend, Betty, was originally inspired by Betty Page, and she wasn't an actress. She, if I'm remembering correctly, in the comics was a pinup girl, like a model.
My old job.
Yeah, exactly.
In World War II, that's how I, made a few extra bucks.
I might want to unearth some of those old posters. And so they had to...
Wait a minute. This just reminded me, there's that Reddit where you ask people to fix a photograph or something like that. Hey, friends of Does It Fly Pod, have any of you been able to locate any of my World War II pinup posters? Send me some. All right.
Well, they had to change her profession once they decided to go a little more family friendly. And to put this in context, so part of the reason this kind of languished in development was, figuring out what approach they were going to take with it. But like I said, this came out in 1991. In 1989, Batman was a huge hit. And I'm talking about Tim Burton's Batman. This was essentially, there'd been a couple of comic book movies. Obviously, you'd had Superman, which had come out, prior and had done really well. But Batman really kicked open the door. That particular Batman really kicked open the door to comic book adaptations. And also Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles had come out and also done really well. So Disney got really jazzed, especially about the idea of all of the different merchandise tie-ins they could do.
You know what? Thank you for that history, because I, in my mind, invented my own history of how comic book movies came into existence. And you know what it was?
No.
In my mind, the generation, because all my life, you know, like I remember being in the Navy, and when we were in training, as soon as we got out of class, we would run to the barracks so we could watch Thundercats, G.I. Joe, right? We're grown men.
But
right?
it's fun. It's fantasy. It's fun, right?
Yeah, but you know, and then I had the comics growing up. So what I feel like is that generation finally became the people making the stuff.
Mm-hmm.
You know, when Gen X started making it, they were like, "Let's do these comics. We love them." Yeah.
Well, and also don't
but you're
forget
like, "No,
that,
it's the money."
Well, also, don't forget too that filmmaking technology played a part in this as well, right?
Oh,
because
right,
and I'll get to that in a sec, but like,
yeah, you're right.
part of it is what an artist can draw could for a long time could far exceed what they could put on screen in a way that was interesting and realistic and made you actually believe it and seemed like anything but a B movie. And so, you know, as we're thinking about the late 80s, like think about these movies, think about Batman, think about this movie, you know, this was the era right before CGI. So special effects.
Before.
Yeah, this is not CGI yet. This is the very end of the era where you used models and you used a combination of, you know, different effects in post-production.
So how did Rocketeer fly? How did they do?
So there's actually there's a really great interview on the befores and afters website, which is a visual effects and animation online. We'll call it a destination. It's a magazine and it's a podcast by a journalist. And I haven't heard him say his name out loud because I've read his stuff, not listened to his stuff. It's Ian, Failes. And this particular interview is with stop motion animator Tom St. Amand, who is one of the folks who worked on this movie and is primarily responsible for what you see on screen, along with an amazing team. And something else that's interesting too, fun fact, is that Joe Johnston, the director, worked at ILM before he began directing. So he worked on the original Star Wars trilogy, and one of the movies he had done, Honey, I Shrunk the Kids, obviously huge special effects. And that's part of what gave the Disney brass confidence that he could bring The Rocketeer, which was also going to be a heavy special effects movie, to life. So in this interview, they kind of break down how they did all the Rocketeer shots. And they had to create miniatures. So they actually did a miniature of actor Billy Campbell, who plays the Rocketeer, you know, wearing all of the clothes that he wore. So, you know, just really getting into the details of, you know, sculpting the leather jacket properly. And, you know, because her point was that if she did it wrong, you might not know what was wrong, but we as humans would perceive that something was just off. And when they went to meld the live action shots that they did on set, the practical effects, with what they then shot stop motion wise in post production, you just like your gut would go, something's not quite right here. And so there had to be a lot of coordination between the live action that was shot, and so a lot, and what was happening in post. So they did a lot of work with the storyboards, you know, working with the DP to confirm exactly what these shots were going to look like.
Dean of Pledges?
DP, yes, Dean of Pledges. DP would be the director of photography.
Oh, director of photography. Yes. You know, it's interesting that you mentioned this approach because, you know, you're talking about 1991. And I don't know when that flash with Batman, where you had two flashes and he goes back in the past, gives his power to the other Flash by recreating the accident that made him the Flash. And when he's like running in the Speed Force, he's doing this, right? And those effects are notoriously bad in that movie.
Well, look, there's a lot of movies where the effects do not age well. So, you know, it's really...
I think this movie is from like 2025 tomorrow. This is not.
Oh, that's not good. That's not good.
But anyway, they went very careful in 1991 and made it look realistic in the outcome.
Yeah, and they were really good with planning out the stop motion control. So if you think about it, when I say they made a miniature of the Rocketeer, think of it like they basically made a puppet that articulated. And when I say articulated, I mean motion for each of his limbs, each of his digits, each piece. So the way stop motion works is that for every frame, you go in and you stop and you make a little adjustment and you shoot it. And then you make a little adjustment and you shoot it. So it can take anywhere from like 30 minutes to 3 to 4 hours to set up these shots. And then you have to marry that to what's happening.
Set up. You mean like to film a sequence or just to begin the process of getting ready to film?
No. To film the sequence.
Got it. Okay.
Yeah. So when you're filming stuff, every different shot that you have is called a setup. So yeah. So, and then they had to go in after they married all of these different elements. They actually had to go in and animate the rocket fire, like the fire that was actually coming out of the jetpack.
So they didn't make real fire on the miniature.
That would have burned up the miniature, which would not have been good.
By the way, when you talked about this miniature, where I'm from, where I was born in New Orleans, we call those voodoo dolls. But anyway.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I don't think anyone was sticking pins in it, but yes.
You need a lock of his hair or something, right?
Exactly. Well, I don't know. Maybe they could have used some voodoo help. Maybe that would have cut down on the budget a little bit.
Right? Yeah. Voodoo is notoriously efficient. But go ahead.
Right. But the ILM 2D animators, they, went in and hand animated that. And, they were so attentive to detail. They even put in like extra bursts and flashes for when he ostensibly flew closer to the camera. And so, there's a great quote actually. And so when we're talking about like, how does this gadget factor into the storytelling? What I love about the Rocketeer is that there was this marriage between the special effects folks, between the entire crew, putting thought into how were they doing this. Obviously, Joe Johnston at the lead, leading this as the director, to think about character. So Tom St. Amand, and I hope I'm saying his last name right. If you know I'm not, let me know in the comments. So this is just an example of collaboration and the way that they use special effects to tell the story. He said, "We intentionally tried to make the early shots of him look slightly out of control, like a man who was just learning to fly. Any animation I did with the body had to be timed with what Peter had done with the camera. The puppet was generally mounted onto a ball joint, which could be animated to make him turn and roll. In later shots, we calmed him down to indicate that he was getting more assured about flying the rocket pack." I love that marriage between all the artisans working on the film, all the craftspeople. But that's also why before, when you were like, he's an expert right away, I'm like, actually, he's not. Now, his learning curve may have been greatly accelerated. I'll give you that.
I don't know. It's like golf, right? It's like golf. If you can hit a golf ball straight, you're an expert.
My dad would disagree. My dad would strongly
The average person is not getting the ball off the ground. I'm going to my grave on this one tomorrow. I'm sticking by my guns.
We're going to have to disagree then, because I don't think he looks like an expert at the beginning. And I actually think that's part of the character development. He has a learning curve in this. And I think you see that. You see him learning how to use it.
Yeah. He goes from highly competent to more highly competent. Have you ever watched America's Next Greatest Hero? What's his name? Believe it or not, walking on air.
Right. Fun fact, secret here. I may have done a dance routine to that in a talent show when I was a child.
Video time. Production team. Find the video.
No.
Put it on. Put it in the show.
This goes to the grave.
I would love to see Baby tomorrow performing. There
may have been a lot of like, I'm walking on air. I never thought I could feel so free. Flying away on a wing and a prayer.
Oh my God. So perfect. Oh my God. Is that where it all started? Well, anyway, the point is you saw that dude couldn't even get off the ground, right? He couldn't, there was zero competency. You don't start from 90%. He started 90% that, like, oh yeah, he wiggles a little bit in the air. He ain't calm. That's not how that would work. It's like slam into a wall, bop, explode.
All right. But that's you. For me, who is like everyday person watching this movie, I see a guy who tries a gadget who at the beginning is like kind of all over the place and wobbly and like not doing such a great job. But he has already been explained as an ace pilot.
Right.
He's already been explained as a daredevil. He's already shown competency, a lot of competency as a pilot. So for
in the movie,
for me as the everyday person watching this, it flies that this is his trajectory, that pun intended, that this is his trajectory, his learning curve, that it's not perfect at the beginning, that we see moments throughout with like the short bursts. Like it takes into account the fact that, it can only go for short bursts. There's a great scene on a snail ice sculpture.
Look, I got to talk to the audience right here. I got to talk to the audience right here, Tamara, because you're winning the debate right now. I admit that.
It's just my opinion.
Listen, what y'all don't know is when we're off screen and we have a disagreement, we take it to the boxing ring. And typically, she KOs me. And I'm like, Tamara, that's illegal. It's a low blow. But she's like, dude, I'm like 4'4". What can I do? Right? So,
or 11, thank you very much. Do not take away the inches I have.
I'm 4'11". You're 8'2". Is just where my punch lands. But you know what I'm saying? So I really
I've always said my straight horizontal punch is a big asset.
Yeah. All right. So there is a learning curve. That's clear. You're right about that. But there's one thing you just still have not mentioned.
What?
The all-star cast. I mean, you mentioned the cast, but to me, it just stands out what an all-star cast this is. Even like young Jennifer Connelly, right? Mm-hmm. It's like, that is, for a movie that was so obscure or, didn't hit hard when it first came out, you would think that just the stars alone would bring in the audiences, right?
You would have thought, right? Like you had Jennifer Connelly. She'd been in Legend at this point, so she was a rising star. Billy Campbell was an unknown, and actually didn't love that at first, but Joe Johnston really, really pushed for him. They actually wanted somebody who was a bigger name. But then you also had, like, playing the villain, you had Timothy Dalton, who had just come off of doing Bond. So that was a super fun turn to go from playing Bond to playing the villain. Right. And fun fact here, his character was actually loosely based on the classic film star Errol Flynn, who this has since been disproved, but at the time was suspected of having been a Nazi collaborator. So
really?
Yeah. It's been disproved. Wow. I want to be very clear. I don't want to get us in trouble. But at the time this film was made, that's what they, were thinking was going on.
A song was made about that in the 80s by Club Nouveau. It had the lyrics, "How do rumors get started? Started by the jealous people and..."
Nice. So you have been threatening / promising to put together a playlist for me for a while.
I have it now. By the way,
I'm going to put this out to our producers, actually. Yeah. I think we need a Does It Fly podcast playlist on Spotify or Apple Music or your listening place of choice, because we do talk about a lot of music on here and it's actually pretty varied. So I think we need a Does It Fly playlist.
I love it.
Just to put a fine point on it, when it comes to the Rocketeer and when it comes to does this fly, does it fly as, does the jetpack, the rocket belt, whatever you want to call it, does it fly as a device that powers this story, that helps tell us the story of the characters? I mean, even with Peavy, who's his sidekick played by Alan Arkin, we get a great character moment where they keep finding things wrong with it, and Peavy wants Cliff to turn the jetpack into the feds to not get in trouble, and each time Cliff's like, yeah, but it does have this thing wrong with it. Maybe you could fix it. And he appeals to his, tinker ego. And that's how we get to know what kind of character he is. So as a character engine, as a driver of story, as something we get to follow through and see grow and change, I think that the jetpack flies. It's fun. And we get to go on an adventure with it. So from a story perspective, it flies. That said, does it fly for the vibes is a good question. And what I want to know, okay, so before you brought up the burning butt issue, my question is, does it fly for the vibes? Is this something we would want to have in real life?
Yes. And what it is it's a barbecue spot, and that is its name, the Burning Butt. We're wait a minute. Maybe that's a chili store. Anyway.
No, I think it's barbecue. I definitely think it's barbecue.
All right, not the pepper reference. So, the question, I don't know if moot is the right word. So there's different manifestations, right? So if we're talking about a commercial consumer rocket belt, yikes. cars are bad enough. Every vehicle we have, we start slamming into stuff with them. And, this one, the difference between, I haven't seen real statistics, but the probability of injury or death, if you look at it for motorcycles versus automobiles, I've known a lot of people who have had accidents in both. And it just seems to be anecdotally that the probability of severe injury and death is much higher on a motorcycle.
Oh, yeah. This just seems like an air traffic control nightmare. I mean, think about what's happening with drones right now. Can you imagine if there were people up there with them?
Can you imagine if there were people? Oh, man. But, there are daredevils in this world, right? There are teenagers in this world. There are dudes in this world. And crazy stuff is going to happen. And then I guess, in terms of their, because what will happen is that if you start mass producing them, the price is going to come down. More and more people are going to have them. And now, they're going to be used for bad purposes. And I just wonder, is there some advantage to that? Like, suppose I'm going to drop in, rob a bank, and jetpack my way out of there. Does that make me more vulnerable? Because now it's easy to identify me and it's easy to see me.
Right. Okay. So I have that question as well. Because let's just take away I'm going to jetpack my way to the grocery store because I don't feel like getting in my car today. So take away the everyday consumer. If we go back to what you're talking about, which is crime, or kind of the original intent of this was being developed in the movie by Howard Hughes. It was ostensibly going to have military applications. My thing is, for military applications, this thing makes a lot of noise. So they're going to be discovered. It seems entirely impractical to have as a thing in the real world to help you fight.
Yeah. Well, what they use it for, the video that's really viral on the internet is a guy going from one ship to the other ship while at sea. Right. So that, if you imagine, how do you pull that off normally? And it was big wooden ships. They pull up side by side. You jump over with your sword. But
can I just say that I've been watching Shogun, and you just reminded me of that, and I love it so much, and so I just have to give a plug for Shogun. Sorry. Anyway.
All right. Well, I've been watching the news, and they got pirates out here. Imagine these countermeasures they use for the pirates. You get them out of their speedboat, they all jetpack on board. It becomes another level of. Well, I guess you can still hit them with the water hose. You'll be more stealthy parachuting in, huh? Because at least it's silent.
You actually would. It's quiet, right?
The impracticality of them is about fuel and control, right? They just burn through fuel way too fast. Even if you look at the rockets that we use to get to space, quite often they're staged. One rocket, takes you to its maximum altitude, the big one, and then you fire smaller rockets from there, right?
Yeah, and that's why they fall away, so that you're not. You carry the fuel that you need to a certain stage. It falls away so that you're not dragged down by the mass of those fuel containers.
Yeah, exactly. And
these are things you learn when you go to space camp as an adult.
Huntsville Diaries.
Yeah.
Are we talking about this? Yeah.
Have we talked about
this? So they if you think about this rocket, it's gonna you would need. The thing is, the guy flies really, really fast. And as far as time goes, as far as these rocket packs goes, it's for an extended period of time at that speed. Yeah. And so the rate of speed is determined by two quantities: how fast you throw stuff out and how much stuff you throw out at a time. You throw out more stuff at a slower speed or less stuff at a higher speed, you can get the same effect, right? And so chemical rockets throw out a lot of stuff at a high speed. And it's that lot of stuff part that makes them so energy hungry. And you're just not going to be casually using these, right? It's going to be worse than an electric car in terms of, I have to recharge it and that sort of thing. It's more like, the model has to be more like a propane tank for your grill, right? I need to go to Home Depot. You rocket pack your way there. You give them those 2 rocket packs, get yourself 2 new rocket packs, and then you go home. And so everywhere you go, you need to be able to exchange your tanks.
This just does not sound on any level like it makes sense in the real world. And I will say, I really enjoy
Very niche.
Yeah, I really enjoyed this movie. I actually think, like you were saying when we started, it's a movie that did not great at the box office. I mean, this was originally planned to be a whole franchise, and they didn't make more movies because it did not have the box office they wanted to. But it's a movie that over time people have really come to appreciate. I think it's a great family movie.
Yeah.
But when it comes to should these rocket jetpacks, belts, whatever we're calling them, be in use in real life, especially for everyday consumers, I say it does not fly.
You say it does not fly? Well, I say the question has already happened. Not at the consumer level, not at the average person level, but I think in niche cases it can be. So I think that for where it is effective and appropriate, I say it does fly for the vibe. We have a split decision, people.
Whoa, split decision.
No yes, no yes.
We want to know what you guys think since we are having a split decision between the two of us. So you can find us at Does It Fly Pod on TikTok. You can find us on Instagram, a whole bunch of other places, and of course at doesitfly.com, YouTube, and let us know what you think.
Yes, and I have to let you know that Does It Fly is the pod that's okay to eat. Too dad jokey?
I don't...
You know, the detergent pods, they look pretty like candy. And
I might have missed that.
How did you miss that? Oh, you didn't miss the people eating Tide Pods?
Oh, now that's ringing a bell.
Yeah. Does It Fly? The pod that's okay to eat.